A physicist walked into my clinic claiming he'd tasted quantum particles, and that time itself was slipping through his fingers. I'm Dr. Jacob, and this is the strangest case I've ever seen. The story of Dr. Alex Thompson, whose accidental discovery blurred the lines between physics and medicine, pulling us both into a mystery that could change everything. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as I made my rounds through the hospital ward that morning. Everything felt routine. Checking charts, greeting patients, discussing cases with nurses. 20 years of medical practice had taught me to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared me for what walked through my door that day. Little did I know that my understanding of medicine, of reality itself, would be challenged in ways I couldn't imagine. The human body had always fascinated me. Its complexities, its resilience, its mysteries. But what was about to walk through my door would force me to question everything I thought I knew about the limits of human experience. The day had started like any other. Coffee in the break room, the familiar faces of my colleagues, the steady rhythm of morning rounds. I remember pausing at the window of my office, watching the autumn leaves dance across the parking lot. Medicine had become predictable in many ways, each diagnosis fitting neatly into categories I'd memorized decades ago. Even the occasional medical mystery usually turned out to be something documented in textbooks somewhere. But medicine, like life, has a way of shattering our comfortable assumptions. Later, I would learn about Dr. Alex Thompson's brilliance, a quantum physicist whose work pushed boundaries most wouldn't dare approach. His lab across town was a temple of cutting-edge technology, where massive machines probed the tiniest building blocks of reality. Alex lived for those late nights alone with his equipment, chasing theories that could revolutionize computing. The path that led Alex to that fateful night was paved with countless hours of research and dedication. His office walls were covered with complex equations and theoretical models that looked more like abstract art than science. Quantum mechanics wasn't just his profession, it was his obsession, his way of trying to understand the deepest mysteries of our universe. His colleagues spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and concern. Alex had a reputation for pushing boundaries, working alone when others had gone home, pursuing theories that seemed more science fiction than reality. The university tolerated his eccentric methods because his results were undeniable. 3 published papers had revolutionized our understanding of quantum entanglement, and his work on quantum computing promised to transform the field. But brilliance often walks a razor's edge between genius and recklessness. The sterile lab glowed with an eerie blue light that evening as Alex worked. Quantum particles, those strange bits of existence that seemed to defy our basic understanding of reality, danced in their containment chambers. The air crackled with possibility as his instruments hummed, measuring phenomena at the edge of human comprehension. The experiment that night was meant to test a new theory about quantum superposition, the strange ability of particles to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Alex had developed a method to stabilize these states in a liquid medium, something previously thought impossible. If it worked, it could bridge the gap between quantum computing and biological systems. The implications for medicine alone were staggering. He'd checked every calculation, every safety protocol. But sometimes fate has a way of slipping through our most careful preparations. The lab's ventilation system hummed steadily as Alex made his final adjustments. The quantum solution, a shimmering liquid that seemed to dance with possibilities, sat innocently in its container. Years of research had culminated in this moment. The particles within held secrets that could revolutionize our understanding of reality itself. As he leaned in closer to check the readings, his sleeve caught the edge of the workbench. Then came the slip. One small container tipped, and before Alex could react, a spray of quantum charged solution hit his tongue. The taste was sharp, electric, like licking a battery, but stranger. In that moment, he simply cursed his clumsiness and tried to spit it out. How could he have known that tiny accident would tear open the fabric of his reality? He should have stopped right then. Protocol demanded immediate medical evaluation after any lab exposure, but Alex had always been more scientist than safety advocate. His mind raced with possibilities. Could quantum particles interact with biological systems in real time? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. He grabbed his notebook, determined to document every sensation, every anomaly. This was data, he told himself, Even as his hands shook while writing, his heart raced as he scribbled observations in his notebook. The characters seemed to blur and shift before his eyes, but he forced himself to focus. The scientist in him knew this could be the discovery of a lifetime, even as the rational part of his brain screamed that something was terribly wrong. The lab's emergency protocols manual sat unopened on his desk, its red cover a silent accusation. The dizziness hit him first. The lab's clock seemed to flicker, numbers jumping erratically. He convinced himself it was just the late hour and his tired eyes playing tricks. But as he stumbled home through empty streets, the world felt increasingly unstable, time itself seeming to stretch and compress around him like a rubber band. The security guard found him in the parking lot, staring at his phone's clock with an intensity that prompted concern. Alex waved off the guard's questions, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The drive home was a blur. Traffic lights seemed to stretch into infinity, then snap back like rubber bands. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, trying to anchor himself in normal time. But normalcy was slipping away with each passing moment. When he finally reached his apartment, Alex collapsed onto his couch, his mind spinning with possibilities. The world around him seemed to pulse with an otherworldly rhythm. Time stretched like taffy, then snapped back with dizzying speed. He tried to ground himself by focusing on his breathing, but even that simple act felt disconnected from reality. His watch ticked with an irregular pattern that defied logic, and the digital clock on his microwave seemed to skip minutes at random. As exhaustion finally overtook him, his last conscious thought was a mixture of scientific curiosity and primal fear. That night, as I finished my shift unaware, something impossible was taking root. Physics and biology were colliding in ways that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the nature of time itself. And soon, that collision would come crashing through my office door, dragging me into one of the strangest cases of my entire medical career. Alex woke the next morning with a splitting headache and a sense that something was fundamentally wrong. The world seemed to move like thick syrup around him as he prepared for work. His morning coffee took an eternity to cool, yet somehow he found himself running late despite leaving early. The morning light streaming through his kitchen window seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, casting shadows that moved independently of the sun's position. He rubbed his eyes, convinced it was just the aftermath of too many late nights in the lab. But when he reached for his coffee mug, his hand moved through space like a stuttering film reel, leaving trailing images that faded slowly from his vision. The simple act of brushing his teeth became an exercise in confusion. The bristles seemed to move in slow motion across his gums, yet when he checked his phone, only seconds had passed. During his drive to work, traffic lights changed colors at irregular intervals, some stretching for minutes, others blinking past before he could react. He gripped his steering wheel tighter, trying to anchor himself to something solid and predictable. At the lab, everything felt off kilter. A colleague's laugh stretched impossibly long, the sound waves seeming to ripple through the air like molasses. Minutes later, an hour-long meeting flashed by in what felt like seconds. His watch disagreed with every clock he saw, and even those seemed to tick at different speeds depending on where he stood. The lab equipment behaved strangely around him. Digital readouts flickered between numbers that couldn't possibly be correct, and the quantum sensors registered anomalous readings whenever he approached. His research assistant mentioned that the atomic clock they used for precision measurements had started showing microsecond variations, but only when Alex was in the room. He tried to focus on his research, but quantum equations blurred before his eyes. The mathematical constants he'd memorized years ago now seemed to shift and change, as if the universe itself was rewriting its rules around him. During lunch, he watched his colleagues chat and move about, their movements sometimes fluid, sometimes jerky, like a video streaming at variable speeds. Desperate to maintain some grip on reality, Alex grabbed his notebook and began documenting everything. His normally precise handwriting grew increasingly erratic as he filled page after page with timestamps and observations. 9:15 a.m. meeting started. 9:17 a.m. 3 hours of content covered. Impossible. The physicist in him clung to data, trying to quantify the unquantifiable. He started carrying a stopwatch, checking it obsessively against his phone, his computer, and the lab's instruments. Each showed different times with variations that defied any logical explanation. During one particularly unsettling experiment, he watched a drop of water fall from a leaking faucet, hanging suspended for what felt like minutes before finally breaking free. The more he documented, the more patterns emerged, or perhaps his mind was desperately trying to create order from chaos. Time seemed to stretch most when he was anxious, compress when he was focused. But even these patterns weren't consistent. Sometimes mid-conversation he'd find himself responding to questions before they were asked, as if his perception of cause and effect was beginning to unravel. His colleagues noticed his distraction. "You're working too hard," they said, patting his shoulder with patronizing smiles. "Take a break, get some sleep." But Alex knew this wasn't exhaustion or stress. He'd experienced those before. This was different. This was reality coming undone around him. He tried explaining it to his research partner, Sarah, showing her his notes with trembling hands. She listened more patiently than the others, but he saw the concern in her eyes, not for the phenomenon he described, but for his mental state. "Maybe you should talk to someone," she suggested gently. "I know a good therapist." Her words stung worse than the others' dismissals. If even Sarah, who had worked alongside him for years, thought he was having a breakdown, who would believe him? Later that afternoon, he found himself in the break room where a colleague's coffee cup slipped from their hand. Alex watched in horrified fascination as the cup descended in extreme slow motion, coffee droplets suspended in mid-air like amber beads. He had time to move across the room, position a trash bin, and step back before the cup completed its fall. His colleague blinked in confusion, apparently experiencing the event at normal speed. The incident left Alex shaken, wondering how much longer he could hide these temporal distortions from those around him. Alone in his office, he stared at his scattered notes until his vision blurred. His heart pounded as he faced the possibility that he was losing his mind. The quantum particles, the accident, could they have actually affected him on some fundamental level? The scientist in him demanded proof, but the human in him was terrified of what that proof might reveal. That evening, attempting to maintain some normalcy, he tried to watch a movie at home. The experience left him more shaken than before. Scenes jumped forward and backward, dialogue overlapped impossibly, and he couldn't tell if it was the streaming service glitching or his own perception fracturing further. He switched off the TV and sat in the dark, listening to the irregular ticking of his wall clock, each sound falling like a hammer blow against his sanity. As his grip on time grew more unstable, Alex knew he needed help. Not from his physicist colleagues who would demand peer review and reproducible results, but from someone who might understand the human element of his impossible condition. That's when he remembered hearing about me, a doctor known for handling unusual cases. He didn't know it then, but by the time he reached my office, his condition would be far worse than either of us could have imagined. The first time I saw Alex Thompson, he burst through my office door like a man possessed. His lab coat was wrinkled, his eyes wild with a desperation I'd seen countless times before, but never quite like this. As a doctor, you learn to read people in those first crucial moments. Alex wasn't displaying the typical signs of paranoia or delusion. His fear was raw, genuine, and thoroughly rational for a man who believed he was losing his grip on time itself. I've seen trauma victims, psychotic breaks, and every variety of mental disturbance imaginable in my years of practice. But something about Alex's presence made me set aside my initial skepticism. Perhaps it was the way he clutched his notebook, a scientist's lifeline to sanity, or how his eyes darted to every clock in the room, comparing them obsessively. He wasn't showing the typical signs of paranoid delusion. This was something else entirely. His hair was disheveled, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept in days. As he paced my office, I noticed his movements were erratic, sometimes flowing smoothly, other times jerky and uncertain, as if he were fighting against an invisible current. My years of experience had taught me to spot the subtle signs of various conditions, but this was different. Every instinct told me I was about to hear something that would challenge my medical understanding. "Dr. Jacob," he said, his words tumbling out faster than his mouth could form them. "I know how this will sound, but please, you have to listen." He told me about the quantum particles, the accident, the taste like electricity on his tongue. Under normal circumstances, I might have dismissed such claims immediately. But there was something in his demeanor, a scientist's precision even in his panic, That made me pause. I maintained my professional calm, asking measured questions while studying his responses. He wasn't displaying typical signs of mental illness. His thoughts were organized, his memories consistent, his scientific knowledge impressive. Yet here he sat, claiming that time itself was bending around him. He described moments where seconds stretched into minutes and others where hours compressed into mere moments. Yesterday, he explained, his voice dropping to a whisper, I watched a drop of water fall from my kitchen faucet. It took 5 minutes to reach the sink. He pulled out a notebook filled with meticulous observations, timestamps, and calculations, the kind of detailed record keeping only a scientist would think to maintain in the midst of such an experience. What struck me most was his attempt to quantify the impossible. His notebook contained complex equations, attempting to mathematically model his experiences. He had tracked the dilation of time against his heart rate, blood pressure, and stress levels. There were detailed sketches of what he called temporal distortion fields, complete with hypotheses about their mechanics. Even in crisis, the physicist in him couldn't help but try to understand. Following protocol, I ordered a full battery of tests. Blood work, MRI, EEG, anything that might explain his symptoms through conventional means. Alex submitted to each test with the patience of someone desperate for answers, any answers. The nurses whispered among themselves as they drew blood, his reputation as the time-tasting physicist already spreading through the ward. Then it happened. A nurse was carrying a tray of instruments past my office when she tripped. I watched, frozen, as the tray began its descent toward the floor. But Alex moved with impossible speed. One moment he was seated across from my desk, the next he was across the room, catching the tray before it could crash. The nurse stood motionless, mid-stumble, as if caught in amber. For a fraction of a second, I saw time stretch like taffy around him. The air in the room felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. Alex's movements left trailing after images in my vision, like a long exposure photograph coming to life. I found myself gripping the edge of my desk, my knuckles white, as my mind struggled to process what I'd just witnessed. In all my years of medicine, I'd never seen anything that so completely defied explanation. The incident lasted mere seconds, but it felt like minutes. I watched Alex's face as he set the tray down, noting the concentration in his expression. He wasn't surprised by what had just happened, he was controlling it. The implications made my head spin. If he could consciously manipulate time's flow, even for a moment, what else might be possible? The moment passed quickly. The nurse regained her balance, thanking Alex profusely while shooting me a confused look. But I had seen it. In that instant, everything changed. This wasn't mass hysteria or shared delusion. I had witnessed something that defied every medical and scientific principle I knew. Looking at Alex, I saw the same realization in his eyes. He wasn't crazy, and now he had a witness. "No, you understand," he said quietly, returning to his seat. "What's happening to me isn't just in my head." The implications were staggering. If what I'd witnessed was real, and I knew it was, we were standing on the edge of something revolutionary. The medical applications alone were mind-boggling. Imagine being able to slow time during critical procedures, or stretch a crucial moment when every second counted. But with that potential came danger. If others learned about this, Alex would become the most sought-after research subject in history. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders. As a doctor, my first duty was to my patient's well-being. But as a scientist, I couldn't ignore the magnitude of what we might be dealing with. The universe's most fundamental force, time itself, was somehow being bent by the man sitting across from me. Every medical text, every scientific principle I'd ever learned seemed inadequate in the face of this reality. We were in uncharted territory, and I knew that whatever came next would change both our lives forever. I closed my patient notes and leaned forward. "No," I replied, my medical skepticism warring with what I'd just seen. "It's not, and we're going to figure this out together." But the test results arrived like pieces of an impossible puzzle. I spent hours in my office, staring at brain scans that defied conventional medical understanding. The temporal lobe activity was unlike anything I'd ever encountered, patterns that pulsed and shifted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Areas associated with time perception weren't just active, they were practically incandescent with neural activity. The readings showed intense activity in regions typically dormant during normal brain function. His hippocampus, crucial for memory formation, was firing in synchronized patterns with areas responsible for spatial awareness. More intriguingly, the scans revealed unprecedented neural pathways forming between his cerebellum and frontal cortex. These connections shouldn't exist, yet there they were, pulsing with an energy that defied conventional neuroscience. I called an emergency meeting with the hospital's top neurologists and, against better judgment, invited several quantum physicists from the local university. The conference room crackled with tension as medical minds clashed with theoretical physics. Voices rose and fell as theories were proposed and dismissed. One physicist, her voice trembling with excitement, suggested that the quantum particles had somehow created a bridge between human consciousness and quantum mechanics. The particles might have altered his neural pathways, she explained, pointing to the unusual brain activity patterns. If they've somehow quantum entangled with his temporal lobe neurons. The neurologist scoffed, but I couldn't dismiss it, not after what I'd seen. As the debate raged on, I noticed subtle changes in Alex's behavior during our regular monitoring sessions. His reactions to sudden noises became preternaturally quick. He could catch falling objects before they hit the ground, describing the movement as if watching through a slow motion camera. During our tests, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to predict the exact moment a timer would buzz, down to the millisecond. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Alex called me late one night, his voice shaking. He'd nearly crashed his car on the way home from the lab, but something extraordinary had happened. As the other vehicle swerved into his lane, time had stretched around him. He described watching the approaching headlights in slow motion, having what felt like minutes to adjust his steering while seconds passed in the outside world. I drove to his house immediately, found him sitting in his kitchen, hands still trembling around a cold cup of coffee. The scientific detachment he'd maintained was cracking, revealing the raw fear underneath. "I should be dead," he whispered. "By all laws of physics and probability, I should be dead." The incident had left more than psychological marks. His blood tests showed elevated levels of quantum markers, microscopic traces of the particles that had started this whole journey. They were somehow maintaining a stable presence in his system, defying the laws of particle decay. Each test revealed these particles weren't just surviving, they were integrating with his cellular structure. Watching him recount the incident, I felt my last doubts evaporate. The quantum particles hadn't just affected his perception, they'd fundamentally altered his relationship with time itself. As a doctor, I'd been trained to seek rational explanations, to trust in established medical science. But sitting there in Alex's kitchen, watching him struggle with abilities that rewrote our understanding of reality, I knew we'd crossed into unknown territory. "We need to understand this," I told him, my mind already racing with possibilities. "Not just for science, but for your safety. Whatever's happening to you, it's getting stronger." He nodded, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I trust you," he said simply. "You're the only one who's seen it, who believes me without thinking I'm insane." That trust became our foundation as we delved deeper into the mystery. I began documenting every instance of his temporal manipulation, creating detailed logs of each occurrence. The pattern was abilities were growing stronger, more controlled. Sometimes, during our sessions, I'd catch glimpses of it myself, moments where his movements seemed to blur, where time itself appeared to bend around him like light through water. The weight of that trust settled heavily on my shoulders. I'd sworn an oath to do no harm, to help those in need. But how do you help someone who's become a living quantum experiment? How do you treat a condition that shouldn't exist? Looking at the fear and hope mingled in Alex's eyes, I made my decision. We would explore this phenomenon together, carefully and methodically. Not just as doctor and patient, but as partners trying to understand something that could change everything we thought we knew about human potential. Over the next few weeks, we established a rigorous testing protocol. Under controlled conditions, Alex learned to trigger his abilities at will. We measured the energy expenditure, monitored his vital signs, and mapped the neural activity during these episodes. Each test brought new revelations and new questions. The quantum particles hadn't just changed him, they'd opened a door to possibilities we were only beginning to understand. What I didn't know then was that understanding it would be the easy part. controlling it and protecting it from those who would exploit it would prove to be our real challenge. We transformed a quiet corner of the hospital's research wing into our private laboratory. The space filled quickly with monitoring equipment, sensors, and enough computing power to rival a small tech startup. Whiteboards covered the walls, filled with calculations and observations that blended medical terminology with quantum physics equations. The equipment hummed day and night, measuring every fluctuation in the local environment. We installed sensors to detect electromagnetic variations, quantum field disturbances, and even subtle changes in gravity. Each piece of data could be the key to understanding how Alex's abilities worked. I spent countless hours calibrating instruments, ensuring every measurement was precise. Alex's training sessions started small. We began with simple exercises, timing his reactions as he attempted to catch falling objects. At first, the results were inconsistent. Sometimes he'd move with impossible speed, other times he'd miss completely. Frustration etching deeper lines in his face, but gradually patterns emerged. I documented everything. The way his pupils dilated seconds before a time shift, the subtle change in his breathing pattern, the slight tremor in his left hand that preceded each successful attempt. Through it all, I watched his exhaustion grow, noting how each manipulation of time seemed to drain him physically. The breakthroughs came in small increments. Some days, Alex could barely affect a falling leaf. Other days, he'd demonstrate control that left us speechless. We learned that his emotional state played a crucial role. Stress and anxiety made his abilities erratic, while calm focus enhanced his control. I began incorporating meditation techniques into our protocol, teaching him to center himself before each attempt. One morning, we achieved our first major breakthrough. Alex managed to slow the descent of a falling coffee cup for nearly 30 seconds, giving him ample time to catch it while the rest of us watched in stunned silence. The liquid inside hung suspended, ripples frozen in mid-air like a photograph. When time resumed its normal flow, the coffee splashed normally, but Alex was drenched in sweat, trembling from the effort. The data we collected was revolutionary. Using high-speed cameras and precise atomic clocks, we measured localized time dilation effects that shouldn't have been possible outside of massive gravitational fields. The implications were staggering. If we could understand and control this ability, the medical applications alone were mind-boggling. The physics team we consulted was baffled by our readings. According to their models, the energy required to create such temporal distortions should have been astronomical. Yet Alex was doing it with nothing more than his consciousness and whatever changes the quantum particles had wrought in his system. We ran test after test, trying to understand the mechanism behind his abilities. I found myself imagining complex surgeries performed in stretched time, giving doctors precious extra minutes when seconds counted. Trauma responses that could be slowed, buying time for critical interventions. The possibilities seemed endless, but with each success came new concerns. After particularly intense sessions, Alex would experience migraines that lasted for hours. Sometimes he'd lose track of time completely, unable to tell if minutes or hours had passed. I monitored his vital signs obsessively, watching for signs of physical deterioration. We established strict safety protocols. No time manipulation experiments without full medical monitoring. No sessions longer than 30 minutes. Mandatory rest periods between attempts. I insisted on daily health checks, watching for any signs of cellular degradation or neurological damage. Despite our precautions, each new test pushed the boundaries of what we thought possible. During one particularly challenging test, Alex managed to create a time bubble large enough to encompass both of us. For what felt like 10 minutes, we moved through a world frozen in perfect stillness while only seconds passed outside. The experience was exhilarating and terrifying. The power to manipulate time itself was in our grasp, but at what cost? Late one evening, as we reviewed the day's data, I caught Alex staring at his hands with a mixture of wonder and fear. "Sometimes I feel like I'm coming apart at the seams," he confessed quietly. "Like I'm spreading too thin across different moments in time." The strain wasn't just physical. Alex described experiencing moments of temporal displacement, brief instances where he felt disconnected from the normal flow of time. He'd see after images of movements before they happened, catch glimpses of possible futures that never materialized. These episodes were increasing in frequency, a development that troubled me deeply. His words sent a chill through me. We were pushing into unknown territory with no map and no way to know the long-term effects of what we were doing. The scientist in me was thrilled by each new discovery, but the doctor in me worried about the toll it was taking on my patient, my friend. We documented everything meticulously, knowing that each observation could be crucial for understanding the limits and potential of his condition. The hospital board, initially skeptical, began taking notice of our work. They saw the potential applications in emergency medicine, in surgical procedures, in any situation where time was the enemy. But they couldn't see the toll it was taking on Alex. The way each success seemed to chip away at his connection to normal time. What we didn't know then was that our careful documentation and controlled experiments were about to become irrelevant. The world was about to discover Alex's ability, and everything we'd built would be threatened by forces beyond our control. It started with whispers in the hospital corridors. A nurse had witnessed one of our testing sessions and couldn't keep quiet about what she'd seen. Within days, the story spread like wildfire. Local newspapers ran headlines about the time-bending physicist, and my office phone rang constantly from reporters and research institutions. The media frenzy intensified when a grainy video surfaced online, showing Alex manipulating time during one of our controlled experiments. Though the footage was blurry, it clearly captured a moment when he slowed the fall of a glass beaker, stretching seconds into minutes. The video went viral within hours, drawing millions of views and spawning countless theories about its authenticity. Skeptics claimed it was cleverly edited, while believers hailed it as proof of a scientific breakthrough. I watched helplessly as our carefully guarded secret became fodder for late-night talk shows and morning news segments. The calm, controlled environment we'd cultivated shattered overnight. Security guards began intercepting people trying to sneak into the research wing. My email inbox flooded with messages from pharmaceutical companies, military contractors, and government agencies, all demanding access to Alex and his remarkable ability. One morning, I arrived to find 3 men in expensive suits waiting outside my office. They represented a private research foundation, they said, with virtually unlimited funding. Their offer was substantial: a state-of-the-art facility, complete autonomy, and enough money to fund our research for decades. But their eyes were cold, calculating, and I could sense the implicit threat beneath their polite smiles. Alex paced my office that afternoon, his footsteps wearing a path in the carpet. We could do so much good with those resources, he argued, but his voice trembled with uncertainty. I watched him struggle with the weight of the decision, torn between the potential benefits and the gnawing fear that we'd lose control of his gift. The weight of responsibility pressed down on both of us. Alex's ability had grown stronger, more precise, but so had the risks. During one particularly intense practice session, he managed to create a bubble of slowed time that lasted nearly an hour. The achievement thrilled us, but the toll on his body was immediate: nosebleeds, migraines, and a bone-deep exhaustion that took days to fade. Each new milestone came with a price, and I couldn't shake the fear that pushing too far might break him permanently. These people don't care about healing, I told him firmly. They see you as a weapon, a tool to be used and discarded. The words tasted bitter, but I knew they were true. The medical applications we dreamed of would be forgotten in the rush to weaponize his ability. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Alex was leaving the hospital when a man stepped out of the shadows of the parking garage. "Time isn't meant to be contained," the stranger said, his voice soft but menacing. "You'll learn that soon enough." By the time security responded to Alex's call, the man had vanished. That night, as thunder rolled outside my office windows, I made a decision. We would protect this discovery, keep it focused on healing. I'd seen too many medical breakthroughs twisted into weapons, too many good intentions paved over by greed and ambition. As I sat there in the darkness, lightning illuminating the rain-streaked windows, I thought about all the medical breakthroughs that had been weaponized throughout history. Penicillin, meant to heal, had been manipulated to create biological weapons. X-rays, designed to see inside the human body, had been twisted into tools of destruction. Even the atom, split to provide clean energy, had instead unleashed unprecedented devastation. We couldn't let Alex's gift follow the same dark path. "We do this our way," I told Alex the next morning. "No corporations, no government agencies. We focus on saving lives, one patient at a time." The relief in his eyes told me it was the right choice, but we both knew it wouldn't be easy. We implemented strict security protocols. Only a handful of trusted staff members knew the full scope of our work. We moved our research to different locations within the hospital, never staying in one place too long. Every test, every breakthrough was documented in code, stored on encrypted drives. The pressure was constant. Each day brought new attempts to access our research, new threats thinly veiled as opportunities. But we held firm, drawing strength from our shared conviction that this gift, this incredible, dangerous ability to manipulate time, belonged in the hands of healers, not soldiers or corporations. The hospital board called an emergency meeting, demanding explanations and assurances. I spent hours defending our work, emphasizing its medical applications while carefully avoiding any mention of the military potential. Some board members understood the gravity of what we were protecting, but others saw only dollar signs and reputation risks. In the end, they agreed to let us continue our research, but under strict oversight and with regular progress reports. It wasn't ideal, but it gave us room to breathe, to focus on what really mattered, using this extraordinary ability to save lives. What we didn't realize was that fate was about to force our hand. A desperate case would soon arrive that would test not just Alex's ability, but our resolve to use this power only for healing. The storm we'd been trying to avoid was about to break, and time itself hung in the balance. The call came at 3 in the morning. A 6-year-old girl had been rushed into emergency surgery with a complex heart defect. Even before I reached the hospital, I knew from the urgency in the surgeon's voice that we were facing impossible odds. The procedure required precision that exceeded human capabilities, movements too delicate to perform at normal speed. The surgical team was already assembled, their faces grim as they reviewed the scans. The complexity of the defect was unlike anything they'd encountered, a maze of malformed vessels that would require superhuman precision to navigate. Standard procedures wouldn't suffice, and time was their enemy. Every second that passed decreased her chances of survival. As I hurried through the hospital corridors, my mind raced through possibilities until it settled on the one option we'd been hesitant to use. I found Alex already waiting in the surgical wing, his face pale but determined. He'd heard the details through our emergency protocol system. The girl's parents huddled nearby, their faces etched with a desperation that cut straight through my professional detachment. Their daughter had maybe hours left without intervention. "I can slow it down enough," Alex whispered, his eyes meeting mine. "Give the surgical team the time they need." The risk to himself was clear. He'd never maintained his temporal manipulation for more than a few minutes. This surgery would require at least an hour of altered time. The operating room hummed with tension as we prepared. I briefed the small team we'd chosen, our most skilled surgeon, and 2 trusted nurses who knew about Alex's ability. The girl looked tiny on the operating table, her chest rising and falling with mechanical precision under the ventilator. The monitors cast a pale blue glow across the room, their rhythmic beeping a countdown to what we were about to attempt. I'd seen Alex manipulate time before, but never for something this crucial, this delicate. The surgical team stood ready, instruments gleaming under the harsh lights. Years of medical training had prepared them for almost anything. But this was beyond the realm of conventional medicine. Alex positioned himself in the corner, close enough to extend his influence over the surgical field, but far enough to stay clear of the procedure. I watched his face as he began to focus, saw the familiar strain appear around his eyes. The air seemed to thicken, like honey flowing through time. The surgeon's movements became preternaturally smooth, each cut and suture flowing with impossible precision. Through Alex's influence, what would have been frantically rushed movements transformed into a deliberate dance. I monitored both patients, the girl on the table and Alex in his corner, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. Minutes stretched like hours in the temporal bubble. The heart monitor's beeps elongated into deep, whale-like sounds. Blood moved like slow rivers under the surgeon's hands. Alex's breathing grew labored, but his concentration never wavered. When I caught his eye, I saw the same determination I'd witnessed in all our tests, but this time it was fueled by something deeper than scientific curiosity. The rest of the team moved in slow motion, their actions precise and deliberate in the altered time stream. Through the temporal distortion, I could see the intricate dance of surgical repair unfolding, tiny sutures being placed with perfect accuracy, vessels being redirected with impossible care. The girl's heart, exposed and vulnerable, seemed to pulse in sync with Alex's concentration. Halfway through, Alex's nose began to bleed. I moved to stop him, but he shook his head fractionally. His message was clear: the girl's life meant more than his comfort. We discussed the risks of extended temporal manipulation, the strain it put on his neural pathways, the potential for permanent damage. But in that moment, such concerns seemed distant against the immediate need to save a child's life. The surgery succeeded. As Alex finally released his hold on time, the room snapped back to normal speed. The surgeon stepped back, nodding with quiet satisfaction. The girl's heart beat strongly, properly repaired, and Alex, despite his exhaustion, managed a tired smile before collapsing into a chair. That night marked a turning point. Word of the miracle surgery spread through medical circles, but this time, the response was different. Instead of fear or greed, we received quiet support from healthcare professionals who understood what we were trying to achieve. Other hospitals began reaching out, not to exploit Alex's ability, but to establish protocols for similar emergency interventions. The medical community's response opened doors we hadn't dared hope for. Research hospitals began sharing cases that might benefit from temporal manipulation, creating a network of need that stretched across the country. Each success strengthened our resolve, and each saved life validated the risks we'd taken. Alex's ability, once a source of fear and confusion, had found its true purpose in the halls of healing. We created a network of trusted medical facilities, developed guidelines for when temporal manipulation could be ethically employed in treatment. Alex's gift remained our closely guarded secret, but its benefits reached far beyond our hospital's walls. We'd found our path, not in laboratories or government facilities, but in operating rooms and emergency departments where every second could mean the difference between life and death. The transformation in Alex was profound. Gone was the frightened physicist who'd stumbled into my office months ago. In his place stood a man who'd found his calling, using his extraordinary gift to bridge the gap between what medicine could do and what patients needed. The strain of each intervention took its toll, but the light in his eyes when we saved another life made it all worthwhile. Looking back now, I realized that discovery was never meant to be contained in research papers or weaponized in secret programs. It belonged exactly where it ended up, in the hands of healers, helping to save lives one stretched moment at a time. Time itself had shown us its true purpose.